About React, the most fundamental principle in React is the component. A component is a piece of functionality that we can reuse. So a component is, technically speaking, a fraction of the user interface that we can reuse multiple times, right? So, you know, when you go to Ryanair website or EasyJet and you want to book some flights, right? You select 2 days, generally speaking, right? Yeah. When you want to travel and then when you want to return, right? When you want to come back. So you got 2 calendars, generally speaking. So that's the same component that someone has created, and now these companies are reusing multiple times, right? So that's the entire principle in React. This is what we're going to learn now. So when we talk about components, it's important to notice that there are 2 types of components. We have stateless components and stateful components. We'll learn the differences between them. I will say that, generally speaking, most of the time we'll be creating stateless components because they are easier to manage, they are simpler, you know, because they are just simpler, right? But in some scenarios we'll need stateful components, right? We'll talk about that this afternoon in the second workshop. But for now, let's focus on stateless components. So I'll give you an example. Not a real, but a classic example about why components are so useful. So if I want to create a list of players in the Codiri platform, right? I can add some HTML, right? So first of all, the name of the player, right? We got Daniel, and the score of Daniel is, what's your score, Daniel? 45. Yeah. Is okay. Let me make some names, right? Peter, right? I want to be controversial here. So Peter, 68, right? So let's create a basic HTML, guys. So for example, I'm going to create a div surrounding the player name. So then we can do name Peter, score 68, right? Something like that, right? So then of course we can go to the CSS. So we can add a class name equals player, and then on the CSS dot player, we can add a padding, 30 pixels, border, something very ugly, right? Something like that, right? So we can have a list of players. So then I can copy that and paste it several times. So player, Mary, score 91, and then we got Luis, score 59, whatever, right? So then we have a list of players, all good, right? We haven't even talked about React yet. It's just HTML, right? Some lines of HTML, and that's it, and it works. So even though that's absolutely fine, let's guess that now the business says, oh, wait a minute. I want to make the username a bit more prominent, right? Because it's a bit small. So I want to make sure that, you know, the name of the player is more readable. So we can add, for example, an h3 tag, which is a tag in HTML to increase the size of the text. You see, Peter now is bigger, right? So we can do the same thing again, and again. Right, h3, and then h3, right? And then it works, right? Eventually it will work. Okay, so the server, yeah, that's look. So this is one of the reasons why I like to have the console open all the time. Why? Because now my server has crashed. You see the errors at the bottom, right? And if I don't have the terminal with me open, I wouldn't even notice, right? So I would check in, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? Oh, the server is not working, right? So whenever that happens, remember to do npm start and start the server again, right? That may happen sometimes, unfortunately, in 2018. So once we start the server again, it will hopefully display the list of players. All good, right? No problem at all. But now the business said, no, that's not enough. I want to make even bigger titles. No problem at all. Let's change h3 with h1. h1. And it works, right? So now business is happy, but then business comes back to us the day after saying, no, that's not enough. I want to put some italics, some text here, you know, with a different formatting. So we can put EM something like that. So if we put the EM tag, you see, it's now italic. See the difference, right? Right? I mean, what we're doing at the moment is not that important. The important thing is to notice that every time we want to do a change, we need to do it for every single element. That's on a scale. Because I could easily forget to change one of the players. Look, that's wrong. This player has the incorrect font size. It's very easy to forget that we need to update everything everywhere, right? This doesn't scale well, right? And we just have 3 players, but in real life, I mean, at the moment in Codiri, we had more than 200 players, right? Are we going to do that for every player? Definitely not. Clearly not, right? So the way, or probably one of the reasons why React is so popular today is because they had an idea about how to optimize the process of creating boilerplating piece of functionality. You see, we got the same thing, right? It's the same structure. This is the same as that, which is the same as that, right? We just changed some labels, name of the player, score, whatever, but the structure is the same. So we can easily create a template, right? And this is what I'm going to do now. I'm going to create a template. So if the business wants to do any further change, we'll have to apply the change just once and not 3, 4, or 200 times. That's the idea behind React components. I'm going to create a stateless component because, as I said, they are the simplest ones. How do we create a stateless component? Well, technically speaking, a stateless component is just a function. So I can create a function here, and then the name of the function will be the name of the component. So the name of the function will be player. Look at the capital P. So in React, whenever we create components, React suggests to use capitals on the function name. Do you remember? So if, for example, if I do that, do you remember what's the name of this case? Pascal, correct. Pascal. Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. So I'll leave it simple, player. And then as part of player, I can return just HTML. So for example, I can return a div, hello Codiri. Right? So then, because I have a function called player that returns a piece of HTML, look what I can do. I can just display that HTML as a HTML tag. You see? You see? Right? We got the message displayed, and of course, the beautifulness of components is that we can reuse it multiple times, right? So now if we want to change hello Codiri to hello Codiri world, we change it once, and it gets applied everywhere. Any questions? No?
Do we have to write HTML first, then move it to function, or can we just straight go to the function?
So in the long term, your mind will understand upfront that you want to create several components and stuff like that. So in the long term, you'll probably start creating the components straight away. But at the beginning, you may struggle to identify how many components do you need, right? So it's fine as a first step to do all these things as a first step, but it's important before pushing this code to make sure that you refactor it, that you create as many components as necessary. Yeah? So that's not what we want, right? We don't want to display hello Codiri world. We want to display the user or the player details. So technically speaking, we can, look, let me just keep one player. So we can cut all these things and we can paste it here, right? So now we have a player function that will essentially return this piece of HTML. So that means that technically speaking, we can get rid of that and we can put the player 3 times. But what's the problem? Correct. Looks promising. I mean, we easily got 3 players, so we can change the size and it will be applied everywhere, right? Easy. But unfortunately, you are right, the data is not correct. So we need to fine-tune the data. We need to change that variable here and that variable there, right? So with React, we can send properties from here to there. How do we send properties? Yes, as HTML attributes. So we can, for example, pass a property called name, Peter. Another property below, name, Mary. And another property name, Luis. Still doesn't work, because even though we are sending some properties, some variables to the function is ignoring them, right? So, similarly to what we do on the training and coding challenges, we need to declare the arguments. And that's an interesting thing in React. In React, when you create a stateless function like this one, we'll receive a single argument, one argument, that generally speaking we call it props. Props is an object. It's an object that has all these key value pairs. So in other words, to access the name of each individual player, I can do props.name. So here, I can change Peter with curly brackets. That's important. Every time we want to refer to JavaScript in the middle of HTML, we need to use curly brackets. And then we can display props.name. You see? It's quite easy, right? Remember, first of all, you need to send some variables, and then in the component, put props as the argument name. I mean, technically speaking, you can put whatever you want here, right? I guess we, at this stage, we all agree on that. So here we can put Samsung, if we want. So if we change it here, that will work. So it doesn't matter the name of the argument, but generally speaking, the React community used to call it props. Because we want to create a standard code, please call it props. And because props is an object that holds all the properties that we are sending, we can display the name. So you'll tell me now, how can we display the score of each player?
Next to the name,
Yeah.
property,
Yeah.
score. And curly bracket. No, to add every player score.
Yeah, so we can add some random numbers here.
And do the same on the
Yeah,
component.
where?
Instead
Here?
of 68,
Yeah.
put curly bracket.
Like that?
No, inside the curly bracket.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
No, on the top.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I know. Wait. Yes, you are right. I just wanted to prove what happened. Sorry, let me mute. I think someone. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Cool. So, guys, could you please mute yourself? Of course, feel free to unmute and participate at any time. But if you're not talking, please make sure that you're mute. Thank you. So, yeah. So, if you forget to add the curly brackets, you see that this is just a plain text, right? Props.score, right? However, if we surround this expression with curly brackets, then we get a score, right? So that's how React components work in terms of, stateless components, right?
What if we want to change data just for one person?
What if we want to change data just for one person?
Not all of them. All together in one piece of function?
Correct. So, for example, we can have a message here. Welcome to the platform. Right? You see? So we'll have the same message for every player. But we can customize the message for one particular player. So for Luis, for example, message is hello. Please start with the training, right? Something like that. If the line gets a bit long, please make sure that you add one attribute on each line for readability purposes, right? You see that code is way more readable because it's in, one attribute on each line. Yeah, so there is a question, Itamar?
Yeah, I want to ask a very complicated question, so sorry if you don't want to have an answer for it.
Yeah, but wait a minute. Can we, if it's not related to that, can we please finish that, complete that question, and then we'll go with yours, right? So the thing is, we want to display that message for every user except Luis, right? So in other words, we want to check if we have a property called message. If we have it, then display the custom message. Otherwise, display the default message. How do we do that? If. React is not very if friendly, right? We can do if else, but something we can definitely do is ternary. Who said that?
Me, Mo.
Mo, yes. So, Mo, are you on the phone?
Yes.
So you cannot even see my screen, right?
No, I can see the screen as well.
Cool, that's brave.
I'm talking on the phone.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Mo. So yes, so Mo is correct. Mo is correct. So we can have a ternary operator, right? So whatever the ternary operator returns, that will be displayed, right? So how do we put the ternary operator here?
Stop message.
Props.message. How does he know that if he's on the phone, right? He's not even looking at my screen. Right, anyway. Props.message. And then what? Exclamation mark or question mark? Then what?
Props.message.
Props.message. Else the default message, right? Welcome to Call of Duty, right? Look, you see, it works. So if we have the custom message here, then display it. Otherwise, just display a default one, right? This is a ternary operator. Remember, every time you do JavaScript inside of HTML, remember to surround the JavaScript expression with curly braces. Yep. Can we simplify that? Can we simplify the ternary operator?
Yeah, you can put the props message or welcome to.
Correct. Do you remember what we learned yesterday? The OR operator, the AND operator, right? So we can simply do that. Oops. And now the code would look even simpler and more readable, I believe, right? You see? That's great, right? Still works.
It's so simple.
It is. And that's the reason why React is so popular today. Because you can achieve so many things in a very simple way, right? It's very scalable. So, Itamar, what was your question?
Sorry, I think I should try to work on this side project myself. But I wanted to know, what if you wanted to return
Yeah.
the message to the user with the highest score or the lowest score?
You want to return a message to the user with a higher or lower score. Yeah, but we can do that this afternoon with the stateful components. Because to do that, first of all, we need an array of players. So we need to sort the players somehow. And then, yeah, we can do that this afternoon, right? But we need the stateful components for that.
Yeah, all right.
Cool. Yeah.
Is there something else other than render that makes it?
Here.
Yeah, I mean, are there other functions?
Yeah. But listen, ignore that one because that's a stateful components. We'll be learning this function, how this class works this afternoon, right? We'll learn render, we'll learn other functions. So now please focus on stateless, which is the highlighted text. It's literally a JavaScript function that starts with capital, that returns HTML, and of course can receive some properties. Is there any other question? Right? So that's pretty much it. This afternoon, it will be a bit more complicated because these are stateful components that are a bit trickier, but the stateless components are pretty simple. Just one more thing, guys. Generally speaking, please make sure that each component sits on a different file. So whenever you create a component, please create a new file and import it, right? Let's do that. So if I have a component called player, look at what I'm going to do. And this is, to me, a good practice towards making sure that your project scales from a file structure point of view. So I'm going to create a new folder called player. And inside of the player folder, I'm going to create a new file called player.js. You see? So now I will move the file to the player component, right? And then we need, what else do we need to do to use player here? Import, export, correct.
Import, yeah.
Correct, correct. So whenever you have a new file with modern JavaScript, and whenever that file wants to export something that is going to be reused by other components, please make sure you put export default. We'll do a workshop to learn how to export and import and all the different good practices. But for now, remember to put that prefix, export default. So now because we're exporting the player, we can import it from app.js. How do we import it?
Import
Player, and then from player slash. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Technically speaking, we don't even need to put the .js because the server will understand this JavaScript file. But yes, of course, feel free to add .js, right? Right. So now, this is a classic problem. The very first time you create a React component on a new file, and that's not obvious. Look at the error.
Yeah.
Player.js. React must be in the scope using JSX. What?
Import React from React.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Every time you create a React component on a new file, remember to import React from React. Correct. And then, boom, it works. So that's, to me, the only tricky aspect of the process of creating new components, right? And then, probably you've noticed that I created a folder, right?
Yeah.
Why did I create a folder? Well, because generally speaking, every component should have two files, at least. One is the JavaScript, and the other one is the style. Correct. So let's create a new file alongside called player.css, same name, right? It's very consistent from a semantics point of view. Why we did that? Because it's a good practice whenever you create a new component to put on the root tag, line number 5, the class name matching the component name. You see, player. Why? Because now we can import the CSS, right? And then we can move the stuff from app.css. Probably you've noticed already in conflicts that your app.css file has grown a lot. It's very big already, right? We should try to keep that file, the smaller the better. So whenever there is any logic that particularly belongs to any component, let's move it to that component, right? You see? So now to me that looks really solid because I have a player folder with a JavaScript file. The JavaScript file imports the CSS file, right? And then on the CSS, I'll create the styling for the player component, right? So now obviously if I want to refactor my layout, I just need to move the player component somewhere else, right? And then these two files will be moved alongside, right? So that's to me a very good structure to follow whenever you create a new component with React. Remember, create a folder, inside of the folder, create the JavaScript and the CSS, and then try to encapsulate all the JavaScript logic into the JavaScript file and encapsulate all the styling into the CSS. So, any question? No?
Export statement.
Yep. The export statement.
Say export default or something.
Yeah, yeah.
What's the purpose of the default?
Yeah, we'll do a workshop about that. So, but for the time being, export default means that this is the main component. Generally speaking, the only one, but technically speaking, you can export multiple components. But that means that this is the main component you're exporting, right? By using default, that means that then on whoever is importing it, we don't need to use the curly brackets. Probably you notice that sometimes we need to use the curly brackets. If you do export default, we don't have to use the curly brackets. Yeah, we'll do a workshop about that, as I say.
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
So we created a separate folder for player. Do we ever create a folder hierarchy for parent, child?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good question. Yes.
And what's the sort of recommended depth of those folders?
Yeah. That's a good question. Bala. It's not Bala, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So that's a good question. So what happened if we want to create a nested component? Let's do that. I think it's a good exercise. So for example, let's imagine that we want to move the name of the user into a new component. So generally speaking, I recommend you to do the same thing until you are a master of React, in which case you'll be able to do some shortcuts. But on the first stage, you can create a new function. Again, same thing, right? So function player name. The function will return a piece of HTML, right? So then, of course, put the props on it. So then here we can put player name, name equals what? What do we put here? Say it again. Pop. Curly braces. Props. Dot name. Correct. So look at the name journey. So the name is provided by app.js, right? So this is where we declare the name. So then the name gets passed to the player, and the player passes the name to the player name component. So we have a hierarchy of 3 levels: app, then player, and then player name. Right? That's absolutely valid, and that's a very good exercise. It's a realistic scenario. Generally speaking, we have multiple levels of nesting, right? And that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Why? Because now we can do the same thing again. We can create a new component because player name is clearly attached to player. I'm going to nest it inside of player, right? So I'm going to create a new folder called player name. Inside of player name, I create how many files? 2. What's the first one? Exactly. You are all right. So first of all, player name.js, and then player name.css, right? So then we can move player name to the player name component, right? Now it doesn't work, obviously, right? So import the player name. Let's do that. Import player name from player name / player name. Doesn't work. Why it doesn't work? Export. That's correct. We need to export. Export default. Correct. And React.
Import React.
Correct. You're right. You see, it's the same thing again. It's just 2 or 3 steps, right? So please memorize them. Import or write them down somewhere. Import React from React. Oh, React. And the CSS. That's a good point. We'll check the CSS in a minute, right? Still works, right? So now if I want to change the size of the text on the title, on the name of the player, I don't change on the player, I change on player name. So look, as soon as I change it, it immediately reflects the new size, right? So then you mentioned the CSS. So what happens if we want, for instance, to add a background color on the name, for example, yellow? What do we need to do?
Just for the name?
Just for the name, yes. CSS where? Player name, yes. Dot name? No.
You can give the class name from the H1.
Class name, correct. Remember, every time you create a new React component, remember, not on the H1, remember to add a class name on the root element. What's the name of the class name? Player name, yes. Be consistent, guys. Be consistent. Player name, right? Right, and then what? CSS. Player name. And then what? Background color yellow.
Before you need to
Export what?
CSS file.
The CSS files are exported automatically somehow. We don't export anything. But it doesn't work. Why it doesn't work?
You have to import the CSS
Correct. Remember, every time you create a new component, remember to import the CSS. Yep, you see? So to me, this is a very elegant folder structure because
If
we.
you want to have that styling at a higher level,
Yeah.
will that get applied?
Yeah, of course. I mean, technically speaking, it's valid to take player name, move it to app.css, because all the CSS files are connected somehow. So that's correct. You see, it works. Yeah.
If you were to have that same style in multiple files, will the lowest take effect?
Yes. So this is about the specificity. we'll do a very important workshop about how CSS determines which rules are applied to each element, right? So we'll learn all these things shortly, specificity, blah, blah. So don't worry about that now. So for now, bear in mind that even though that's technically speaking correct to leave the CSS anywhere, to me that's smelly. If I have a component called player name and it has some styles, don't drop them on app.css. That's dirty, right? Go create a CSS for player name and then drop it there, right? And then you see, so now it works. And again, the folder structure is very elegant because that gives us a hint about the structure of our player component. I can easily see that the player component has a nested component called player name, and with a deterministic file structure. We always have two files, JavaScript, CSS, JavaScript and CSS. Of course, we may have more files, like images, audio files, it depends on the component, right? But at least we should have two. Why the CSS is important? Because don't forget that a component is a piece of user interface. It's UI, right? UI needs to be styled. Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Maybe in some cases we're not going to need any style. What happens if we want to leave the background white? Fine, we don't need any style, right? But most of the time we'll need the styling for each component, right? So it's a good practice to create the CSS file alongside. Anything else, guys? Yep.
This one components, you can create another folder which one you can name the component, and every single folder with the components encapsulated that one.
So are you suggesting to create a folder called components?
Yeah.
Don't do that. So this is a classic mistake. To do that, components, right? So in the 90s, when we start creating JavaScript projects, so the classic folder structure was JavaScript, and then a new folder CSS, and then a new folder called images, or something like that, right? That was a classic folder structure in all JavaScript and all web development in general, right? That proved to be wrong, because that has huge scalability issues. Eventually, you may have hundreds or thousands of JavaScript files, right? And I'll tell you something else. So one of the principles of modern development is to keep the files that tend to change in parallel, the closer the better. In other words, if I change player.javascript, if I add a new element on the player score, whatever, right? If I change something, it's quite likely that we'll have to change the CSS as well, right? Yeah. New UI, new styling. Makes sense, right? Because of that, I want to have these two files, the closer the better, because they will be changing in parallel somehow. If, however, I have player.javascript here, and then I have player.css there, I may struggle a bit to keep changing, to keep updating both folders, right? So that's why modern web development says that please don't organize your folder structure according to purely technical aspects like the type or the extension of the files. Please group them according to functionality, right? Because we're creating a component called player, please create a player component, right? And of course, right, eventually, for example, you got the details page, most of you, right, in conflicts. So the details page, which is a user interface, that will have nested components as well. But that will help me to understand the structure of your web application. Because if I'm looking for something specific on the details view, I know that I will have to check on the details folder, and I will have to drill down step by step until I find the component I'm looking for, right?
Is it only with React we have to do like different?
I think this is not even about React. This is about development in general, right?
Okay, about the images, where you can put as well in the folder of the company?
Same thing, right? So, for example, let's add a picture for Peter, right? So if we search for a picture on the internet, right, and we download it, so let's make sure we find where the folder is. So Let me try to find my project. So src player, right? So I leave the folder here. Yep. So then you see I got Peter in my folder structure. So then I can somehow import it somewhere. So we can do import Peter from Peter dot JPEG, right? So technically speaking, we can display user's image. Obviously now the images are static, so every user will have the same avatar, right? But the principle is the same. src so we can do that, right? And then you know why the images are so huge? You remember that? We learned that on the first day, last week. If you remember, images are a bit special in CSS. They tend to ignore the dimensions of the parent container, right? So the way to solve that was to add an image tag and then put max width, what? 100%. Correct. Look, and now that looks much better, right?
What if we want to give just for Peter this picture?
Yes, for Peter. Okay, that's a good point. That's a good point. That's a good exercise. What if we just want to put the picture of Peter to the Peter player, which makes sense, right? So then first of all, who is providing the information? Is not player, because player is agnostic. Player doesn't have any information about the player name, right? So that should be provided here. Same thing we did with the message, right? So we can bring another one called avatar. Yes, so then we import the image, right? So probably we should move the image because it's not part of player anymore. So let's move it to the parent folder. And now we can do avatar equals Peter, right? So now, so now I need to go to the player. So now this is not Peter. So how do we display the picture? Props, well, I call it avatar, right? But yeah, image, yeah, whatever. It's avatar because I call it, avatar here, right? So then what we got? We got that the avatar gets displayed for Peter, but it doesn't get displayed for the other players, right? So of course we could try to find individual pictures for the other players. So for example, for Mary, one of our senior developers. Right, so let's drop Mary in the source folder, and then finally, let's play hard. Just a random image for Luis. Yeah, why not? Yeah, junior developer-ish. Right, so now we can do the same thing, right? We can import Mary from Mary.jpg. I'm not sure if it's JPEG or PNG. Let me have a look. All JPEGs, cool, brilliant. And then we can do import Luis from Luis.jpg. Whoa, something like that, right? So then, as you can figure out, we can pass a new avatar for each player, right? Mary, and finally, we can pass avatar for Luis. As you can see, the order of the properties doesn't matter. We can move the properties up and down without any problem, right? So now we got Peter, we got Mary, and we got Luis, right? Individual pictures for each player. Right? This is a good exercise because that proves that the properties, we can send strings, of course, but we can send more complex things like images, right? This afternoon, we'll see how to deal with even more complex data structures like callback functions. We'll learn that this afternoon.
A quick question,
Yeah.
Ricardo. So I'm still not clear about stateless about this.
It's still not clear.
What is stateless about this?
What is stateless?
Yeah.
Stateless means the component doesn't have any state.
Well, the names and the information is the state, isn't it?
No. So state is a keyword in React. So this afternoon we'll learn what the state is. So probably probably the best way to learn what a stateless component is by comparing it against a stateful, right? The only reason why I didn't start with stateful components is because stateful components are more complicated to understand, right? So I prefer you to have an overview about what a component is in React, right? And then this afternoon we'll see how to create a state and when do we need a state and when we don't need a state in React, okay?
I mean, it's probably where I'm coming from. So, say, for example, in the container world,
Yep.
So we don't store any state within the container storage, for example.
Correct.
Which is any information about your application data or
Yep.
anything.
Yep.
So you send it to a backend database or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In this case, we have the player information here. So what is stateless?
But not really, because the player doesn't hold any information about the player. So the player just receives the state from a parent component and it literally just displays, but it doesn't manipulate the data.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Got that, yeah.
Yeah. So technically speaking, the stateful component is the app, because on the app is where we declare the data, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So anything else, guys?
I mean, is it fair to say that it's stateless because the data is static?
Yes, kind of, yes. So that's a good approach to what a stateless component is, but we'll see all the technical aspects, right? So there is a technical way to determine whether a component is stateful or stateless. So I can tell you, that's the only thing I will tell you about that, is if you create this component as a function, that means it's a stateless. If you create the component as a class, that's a stateful, right? So we'll see when to use a class, when to use a function, and why. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
And the other question, I mean, maybe we'll probably come to this later, but those imports there, they're just getting too many.
Too many imports.
After a while,
Yeah.
So can we automate these? I don't know.
Yeah, not at the moment. No, not at the moment. So I think the best way to reduce your number of dependencies, because you are right, that could massively grow over time, is to create smaller, well-focused components, right? Why? Because now, for example, on app.js, we don't care about player name. Why? Because player name gets imported on player, right? So we are delegating the responsibility of importing components from the parent to the children, right? So even though there are no strict rules in that respect, the more components you create, the less imports each component will require.
Okay, I mean, and the other one is obviously things like importing React and
Yep.
then the local CSS.
Yep.
That's got to be done every time anyway. So why can we templatize this or somehow? Or?
Well, so that's a good question. So there is a thing called, I believe, React CLI. So there is a way, I'm not very familiar with that to be honest, but there is a way on the command line to create templates automatically, right? Something like create, React, I'm just making this up. I don't know how's the syntax, right? So, and then component name, like player, right? So that will hopefully create a new component structure with a folder, with all the files automatically, right? So for example, in the Angular world, this is very common. In React, I don't think that's that common, but I'm sure there are some plugins to do it for you automatically.
Sure. Okay. Or even Visual Studio provides some kind of macro or something.
Yeah, I'm sure there is something in Visual Studio to help you on that as well. Yes. Also, one more thing. Another advantage, and this is not purely about React, this is about software development in general. Another advantage of splitting your components into smaller chunks is to reduce the chances of having conflicts. Eventually, especially in February, because you'll be working on the same code base, you'll be potentially touching the same files at the same time, right? What if, for example, Acel changed the title to H3, and then in parallel, Rafa changed the title to H2, right? Eventually, they will have a conflict. Who is right? Right? So conflicts are sometimes hard to solve. We'll see how to deal with conflicts, of course, but they will be very frustrating at some point, right? So because of that, a good practice is obviously try to reduce the number of conflicts. How do we reduce the number of conflicts? Well, by creating more files, smaller, well-focused files, right? Because, for example, if now Acel changes, instead of welcome to Codery, she says welcome to Codery, exclamation mark, and now Megan changed the title to from H1 to H2 to H5, for example, there is no conflicts because they've changed different files, right? So that's why, even though there is no golden rule to eliminate conflicts, it's a good strategy, generally speaking, to split our logic into smaller files, right?
Is there any way to enforce or standardize the styling, for example, for a property called name? I just want it to be throughout my project or my application, I want it to be H5, for example.
Yeah.
Is there any way to sort of enforce?
Yeah, not really. So in the long term, what real product do is they create a list of utilities, right? And they share these utilities across their components. So for example, imagine that we want to have the same font size for all the titles. So they will have on the main app.css file a class name called title. On the title, we can do font size 30 pixels. And then we can have a new class called subtitle. And then font size will be 20 pixels, for example, right? So then, if we want to put a title in the player name, instead of putting H5 or H6 or H whatever, we put deep class name title, right? Right? And then, if on the player we want to change the size of the welcome to Codery, we can put deep class name equals subtitle, right? So any component can reuse, the existing CSS. So that's a good way. So if tomorrow we want to change the size of all our titles, we can simply change it once, and they will get applied everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's what I was asking. Yeah, that's good.
Cool. Jeff.
What is SAS?
SAS. Oh. So SAS is a CSS authoring tool. So we are not going to learn SAS, but we'll be learning LESS. So SAS and LESS are equivalent at some point, right? They are similar, yeah. So the principle behind is pretty much the same. The main difference is LESS is way simpler to set up, and eventually you can get pretty much the same thing, right? That's why LESS is becoming more popular than SAS in the recent times. So LESS and SAS, they are utilities to create more complex CSS. So for example, with LESS, we can create functions in CSS. Right? Same way we create functions in JavaScript, we can create functions in CSS, in LESS as well. Yeah, so we'll do a workshop about LESS towards the end of the book. And the only reason why we are not using LESS yet is because I want you to get familiar with CSS, because not every company uses LESS, right? So if you start learning LESS and then the company don't use LESS, it would be a bit complicated to get used to basic vanilla CSS. So let's just start with CSS, and once we get some expertise with CSS, then let's learn how to make it a bit more complex with LESS, okay?
And a similar question for JavaScript, I guess, something like CoffeeScript or TypeScript.
Yeah, so TypeScript, yeah, this is going a bit beyond the scope of the workshop, I'm afraid. But TypeScript is a meta language created by Microsoft some years ago to add types. So at the moment, in JavaScript, or not at the moment, we've never had types in JavaScript. So what that means? So props. Is props a string? Is props an object? Is props an array? What type of data props is? We don't know, really. We can figure out, because here in line number 7, we got props.name. Oh, that's an object. Right? But it requires a lot of effort and attention, because we need to inspect the details of the function to understand the type of the data. Right? So with TypeScript, which is not part of the JavaScript standard, we can do something like that. Oh, sorry. We can do that. So that's a way to declare the type of props as an object, right? Why this is relevant? Because if someone is invoking the function, even though that doesn't make sense at all, but if someone invokes the function doing that, TypeScript will complain, will throw an error, saying, hey, wait a minute, you're invoking the function sending a string, but this is required to be an object. Be careful with that, right? So this is why TypeScript is useful. I've been using TypeScript for a couple of years, and it's very convenient, especially when you create complex apps that you need to refactor continuously, right? Because TypeScript will quickly detect potential problems while we do the refactoring. But this is beyond the scope of the bootcamp, because TypeScript is a bit, even though it's very relevant in the long term, in the short term, it's probably too much.
Okay.
Anything else? No? Cool. So that was it for today, guys. Thank you for watching. We'll be back to the action at 2 p.m. this afternoon. Thank you, guys.